I don't have a problem with answering questions about alcoholism because I think that it's such a huge problem for so many people, and it's part of my, not duty, duty's too strong a word, it's part of my recovery process to allow people into that part of my life and to own it, and there might be somebody out there who is struggling, who might want some help, who will think, oh my God, that girl's an alcoholic, perhaps she can help me. So that's why I'm prepared to talk about it.
When I first got sober, I used to think this was, really not the thing I wanted to advertise to anybody, that I had this problem. And it's really turned out to be such a source of strength for me to know that I had this problem and to know that I could overcome it. How bad it got was the last time that I ever had a drink. It is the one that particularly stands out, not because it was the worst time, but just because it was the last time. And I had already been blacking out when I was drinking. Pretty much every time I drank, didn't really matter what I drank, or there would be a period of time that I wouldn't be aware of what I was saying or doing or where I was. It's called a blackout. And that had been progressing, and the timings of the blackouts were getting longer.
Well, it didn't, it neither made me it probably didn't make me a better actor, although it did kind of allow certain inhibitions, to, release. But I could never work having had a drink. I would always, it was always after. But it also kind of allowed my imagination also to let loose. I mean, so there are some good things about the alcohol, it just kind of freed me of certain constraints and inhibitions that were necessary to express myself without being shamed or feeling shame from my parents, because my mother was always one to say, and being in the environment of this kind of Irish Catholic, you keep your head down, don't think too much of yourself, and that kind of feeling. So, and of course, they were all drinking as well. Well, I think every time I woke up or tried to wake up, and I just felt like I had a brick in my head, and those things. Of course, that's, you're thinking to yourself, oh, geez, I got to back off for a while here, and then the next night's the same thing, or not even the next night. Could be the next week. It wasn't like that all the time with me. I could drink socially, and but as soon as I had enough, then there was no stopping, and there was no limit, except, the time.
I began practicing yoga out of a need. My need was that I used to be a singer. I used to have to do a lot of public performances, church mainly, choirs, concerts. And every time a performance came up, I would have a problem with my health. And using all kinds of medications and all that to get the best voice on stage used to be a frustration. Then I was never a sports person. So after ordination, I also went into completely no exercise syndrome. So that was telling on my health. And lastly, I'm not ashamed to say this, that I come from a family of addictive history. So I was inclined to go into alcoholism.
I mean, I was 6'9". I remember being in the 4th grade, and the desks came up to here on me. And I remember someone looking into the window saying, "How many times has that kid been left back?" I mean, I was this big at 13 years old. I always felt very uncomfortable in my skin. And I was always looking for something to make me feel comfortable, to take away the unease or they talk about disease or the dis-ease of self. And, you know, it's much easier to come from outside substances to then, you know, as a kid, where do you pull it in from? I mean, unless someone's training you. And, you know, my first substance, I guess, was food, because I was very heavy. But I was shamed by other kids from being fat. And they'd say, "Look, he has breasts." And that was very embarrassing. And drugs and alcohol really it was like a zip line or something. It was just very easy to get into. Everyone was accepted. It was kind of the time, Timothy Leary, tune in, turn on, drop out. I mean, it would have been nice if he told people, get your PhD first. Telling 12-year-olds to do that wasn't the best advice.
Well, the first manifestation of addiction of which I became aware was my extreme problems with money. Debting, using credit when I didn't have money to pay for things, being completely unconscious about my money, how much I had, how much I was spending, bouncing checks, getting into debt, getting embarrassed all the time about money. So I started to address that through the 12-step program a long time ago, about 15 years ago now, I think. And then through my recovery in that program, which has wafted and waned over the years, I became aware that that I might be sexually addicted. I didn't really think so at first, but I heard someone talk about his problems with sexual addiction, and I thought, oh, I really need to talk to this person, because I was getting into some deep trouble.
I think the way one perceives people who are defining themselves as an alcoholic or an addict is that you tend to see them as somebody separate from yourself, somebody, you know, from a voyeuristic position. You're curious about their experience and the extremes that they've experienced. But really you very quickly see that we're all in the same boat, that we're all suffering one way from behaviors which we can't control.
I'm a member of Al-Anon, which is a program designed for family members or relatives of alcoholics. And to qualify as a member of Al-Anon, you basically just need to have had some experience in dealing with alcoholism in your life, with a close relative or friend generally. One of my attempts in the program is to try and identify why I got in a relationship with an alcoholic, since I couldn't identify alcoholics in my own family. The program doesn't require you to identify the root of your behavior, but you know, because of my way of thinking, my logical mind, I tend to do that. And what I've noticed about myself is that certain aspects of my relationship with my parents, and my mother in particular, may have led me to be susceptible to being in a relationship with someone who was not healthy for me. And normally people would know how to get out of that relationship, but my inability to get out of it kept me, in the relationship for a prolonged time. So it's not that I necessarily sought out alcoholism, but when it came into my life, I didn't know how to move away from it.
I came to AA about 7 years ago. I'll be 7 next week, and I didn't want to be in AA. And I came to AA because I was in a psychiatric hospital where I'd had a breakdown. And I was diagnosed by this doctor that I found myself in his office in bits, and he said, you're an alcoholic and you're probably a drug addict and you need to come in and sleep. I hadn't really slept for about, I don't know, 6 or 7 months, and so I went into his hospital primarily for a week to sleep, and at that point I didn't know, I hadn't really taken on board. I think I knew that I was an alcoholic. I knew I was drinking alcoholically, but I didn't think that I was an alcoholic, if that makes any sense. And after about 6 or 7 weeks in the hospital, I got bored of all the other patients who were mostly people who had had breakdowns for other reasons, and so I went to AA. He said to me, I want you to go to AA. So I went to AA, and it was everything I thought it wasn't going to be. And it was an amazing experience. And from that day on, for the next 3.5 years, I went every day to an AA meeting. It was bad enough for me, and I stopped comparing my bottom to other people's in terms of AA. I might compare it in terms of how big is my bum, but I do think that for me, I've been really lucky. I had a rock bottom. It was serious enough for me to take it really seriously, and I haven't relapsed, so I haven't had a drink since that day. And I do think that if you don't experience that kind of drastic situation or intervention, it can be quite difficult to do the steps necessary to stop drinking.
And rock bottom is a basic realization that I don't have to deny who I am. I am who I am, and it's beautiful the way I am. I also hit a realization that these games were counterproductive, and they are going to take me into a spiraling pit where I will self-destruct. That awareness that I can't live on the periphery anymore like this. I need to stop this.
And another thing that was characteristic of my using and drinking was I didn't ever really end the night with the same people that I started out with. It was somehow I wound up with a whole different crew, or with a different person than I began it with. So that all was going on this evening. But the thing that really stood out about this particular night, Lindsay, was that I couldn't explain to the person that I was with where I lived.
Because I was in a relationship with my mother, and you know, what can one do? One's a child, one can't get out of that relationship. So one learns to adapt to it. And the inability to tune out. And so no matter how much I got screamed at by either my mother or by my first long-term relationship, because there was a lot of screaming, I could pull into the shell of not hearing. And it would be like I'd be looking from within my body through eyes that were at the end of long binoculars. And they were an outer shell, and I was inside protected. And that's how I would feel when I was being screamed at by somebody, for reasons that didn't seem justified to me.
Well, I had a really big, I overdosed in my apartment, and my mother had this really bad feeling, and she removed the hinges off the door of my apartment, and I was blue. She took me out. I was 26, and they took me to the hospital, and I was pronounced dead. And I had an adrenaline shot. I didn't even know it was until I saw the movie Pulp Fiction. I came to a couple of days later. I had 2 huge black and blues on my chest. But I was drinking all the time. I was doing drugs. You know, at 385, 400 pounds, I always had black and blues. So I didn't really think anything of it. And they said I had an adrenaline shot. And then I realized an adrenaline shot in your chest, you know, is a long needle going into my heart. And I looked into a 12-step program, and I remember going to a meeting. I mean, I was 26 at the time. It was like, it seemed like a bunch of 40-year-old guys in trench coats. I said, what a group of losers these are. And, you know, I thought I could do it on my own. You know, that own self-reliance of I could do it on my own, and I didn't need anybody else. I think that's a big part of most addicts want to do it on their own, or just can't even ask for help. And I think I was too uncomfortable to ask for help, or not knowing what help was. And it kept me out for years on my own preconceived knowledge of what programs were, what 12-step programs were.
I can remember when I went to my first meeting to deal with the overeating. I went to that program, and on the way there, I started to talk to myself, and I said, why are you doing this? You don't really want to go into another 12-step program. You don't really want to do this. And I was just really trying to convince myself to turn around and go home. And then suddenly I realized how many hundreds of times I had tried to approach this problem through my own efforts. And I said, you know, Jack, you're not going to recover by yourself. You're not going to get better by yourself. You never have. Just keep going. So I went to my first meeting.
In 1984, I was doing a piece at what was then the Quaig Theater, with these 3 short plays by Yeats, and or 2, and I met another person who since has become a yoga teacher, and she noticed, you know, that I wouldn't just have a glass of wine after the rehearsal. You know, I had a 12-ounce glass that I grasped like a gun barrel, you know, and it was just. And she said, you know, so we became friends and friendly, and she says, you might want to take a look at this. And I says, what do you mean? Well, she said, you know, you come to rehearsal, you smell like you've been out all night, you know. You know those pheromones, you know, when somebody says, you know, was tanked up the night before, you know, this stuff just reeks out of you, and you don't smell it, but everybody else smells it. And I says, what do you mean? She says, well, I know exactly what you're going through, because you know, I'm in the program, and this is the way it is. And so she took me to my first meeting.
So I went to this other rehab in Miami, and I was told it was a happening rehab. And I said, wow, what makes this happening? This is, well, Madonna's boyfriend's here. I said, oh, really? I said, yeah, he's really happening, and he's in the rehab. And I said, well, I'm kind of happening. I mean, I was 400 pounds and a junkie, so I know how happening I was. But they said, you know, he's happening, you're happening, why don't you come to this rehab? So I went to this rehab, and it was just terrible. You know, I thought I'd be drinking margaritas on the beach, which I still didn't really think I had that much of a problem. I thought it was everybody else that was my problem. And the kind of joke is, you know, I don't have any problems till I meet other people. So I'm gonna stay in a cave, I'm fine. And so I went to this rehab in Miami, and oh my God, it was horrible. I was just like strapped to a plastic bed, screamed, cried, and detoxed. And, you know, the whole thing of when I got some time, you know, just to get the drugs out of my system. So it took probably 30 days. And they would bring different 12-step meetings in every day. And I was thinking, well, this isn't a bad job. You know, I didn't realize it was voluntary. You know, I thought they were getting paid to do that. I said, well, you know, maybe I could do this.
No, I had difficulty stopping drinking. I mean, in the hospital, they wouldn't even let me hold anything that was slightly like a wine glass. I mean, for the first, I think it was about 5 or 6 weeks, I didn't really leave the hospital. But when I did leave the hospital, I could not look. If I went anywhere, I couldn't look apart from where my feet were going, because I was terrified about seeing pubs or bars or shops that had bottles in them, because it would just freak me out, because I just wanted to have a drink. if I went to a restaurant, which I did much later on, I don't know, 3 or 4 months sober, I remember sitting in a restaurant and this woman had this glass and she was drinking and I was just like that, my stomach was going, I was like, I just wanted her drink. And if people talked about drinking, I felt like it's not fair, what about me? And I can't do that, well, I'm never going to drink champagne and I'm never going to, you know, it was just, I felt like I'd lost my best mate. I thought I'd lost my friend, I thought I'd lost my lover, I thought I'd lost, yeah, you know, I could do life if I had a drink. If I didn't have a drink, what was I supposed to do?
When I first started AA, and I was coming from a place of being quite disgusted with myself, having reached a point of really quite damaged self-esteem. And I surrendered to the program literally with the thought, it's okay if I never have fun again. It's gotten that bad, that it's really okay with me if I guess I'll just never have fun again.
I've always had a Valium or something, and to just have nothing in terms of a substance just was such an uncomfortable feeling that I probably went to 3 meetings a day. Go to 1 in the morning, or 2 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. Probably made 300 meetings in my first 90 days because it was the only place where I kind of felt safe. You know, they say, I mean, everyone has their own thing, 90 meetings in 90 days. Well, that's great. But I mean, it wasn't enough for me. You know, I'm an addict. It was the only place I felt comfortable. I laugh because people say, well, aren't you worried about being brainwashed? I'm saying, if I could take my brain out and put it in a bucket and like shake out all the garbage in my head, I'd love to do that. I said, please brainwash me. I mean, I just don't want what I have. I mean, it wasn't helping me. You know, what was in my brain was certainly not positive. It was toxic waste. How do you get it out? Or at least getting it into a positive flow.
The being pissed and being drunk was horrendous. The getting sober was even more horrendous. Getting sober was horrendous because it was like for the first time in my life, since I was a teenager, I had nothing to smoke and nothing to drink. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know how to be in the moment. I mean, I still have problems with that, but I could only think about forever. How am I going to get on an airplane? How am I going to have a birthday? What am I going to do about Christmas? What am I going to do when I go to a restaurant? How am I ever going to laugh again? How am I ever going to have sex again? I'd done none of those things without drinking. So I just thought my life was over. And I hear lots of people say that they get their emotions back. I already had my emotions because I spent the last sort of 4 or 5 years of my drinking sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. I was a daily drug taker, a daily drinker and a daily crier. And that only got worse when I came in. I mean, that psychiatric hospital, I wrapped myself in a blanket and I cried for 3 months is what I did, and went to AA meetings without the blanket. Came back, got in my blanket and just kept on crying. So I just, you know, I was terrified. Absolutely terrified.
In the program, when a person comes into the program, they're not receptive to complex ideas. You got to keep it simple. And that's the basic, that's one of the basics, right? You keep it simple, stupid. Because you're stupid. You sit down, right? We love you, but you're stupid. You sit down and you listen. And then you start to clear up. When you start to clear up a little bit, then you can say, well, how's your body? How are you feeling in your body? Because you have to detox. You have to get this stuff out of your system. Then you start to feel good. Your energy starts to, and sometimes when you detox, after a few months, after 3 or 4 months, then there's a surge of energy. And you say, why don't you go take a class? Why don't you find out what to do? Why don't you go running, you know? What did you used to do? You used to play ball? Go play ball, you know?
My first reaction to a meeting was, I was incredulous at the deep honesty that people were bearing their souls in a room full of strangers, that people would feel that trusting and that comfortable to say these really describe really intense feelings and things they had done or said, or I think that's what really made me feel so comfortable right away. It was like, wow, well, if they can do it, maybe I can too, you know. And just to see all the variations of the people in the meeting, from young and old and black and white and gay and straight and rich and poor and just and everything in between, and everybody was the same. And that was really profound for me, to see how everyone was just the same.
I think when people hear people talk about their recovery and the things that they did, because the stories can be so amazing and so magical and so interesting, that they might be scared, but they can actually be really inspired to get their own house in order. I think it's different when you just read about them or you see them on the wall in an AA meeting. Then I think it's quite terrifying, because you haven't got any anecdotes to attach to it. But I think once you talk to somebody, I mean, I've heard people making the most amazing amends, and you just are filled with admiration for their bravery and their courage. And then you see the sparkle in their eye that they get from having a completely free conscience.
That's really what 12-step is about. It's enunciating your own experiences and letting others take what they will and leave the rest. In fact, that's what we say. Take what you will and leave the rest. So whatever you say, they can identify with every piece of that they want to, or none of it. So you offer your experience out for the taking. It's not offering it in an advisory way.
I felt at home. I felt, you know, we're all on the same page here, and it's not about the externals. You know, there was something that everybody that I was listening to, everybody was saying, and I go, uh-huh, yeah, I get it. That's right. That's right. Yes, yes, yes. I feel the same way. Yeah, I thought I was all alone. Nobody. Yeah, I identified, and that opened something in me that gave me a little bit of hope.
And I go to AA and I can say to somebody without feeling like a bloody idiot, what do I do with this? How do I handle this situation? And I get the most amazing advice without the ego, because they haven't got an interest in me. They're not trying to manipulate me because they know the characters or the stories. So it's like my family, but it's like the biggest family in the world, and it's just full of love, and it is the most amazing organisation. It is community like you just don't get anywhere else.
The success rates of 12-step programs are always in question. People are always bringing that up. The thing that 12-step programs do is they get people to stop, which is the critical thing. One of the people that got me even more interested in this subject than I am now was Father Joe Pereira, who in India heads up 41 facilities that are dealing with people who are addicted, you know, suffering from some kind of substance abuse, and some people are kind of have you know, addiction-related illnesses like HIV, things like that. And he's a Catholic priest, and for I think about 25 years something, he's been running these institutions based on the work of B.K.S. Iyengar and yoga, right? So he's not only a Catholic priest, he's a very advanced yoga practitioner, and he's had 25 years experience of dealing with people, treating them right from the very beginning with yoga, right? So they come in, they start 12-step, they start yoga, they start other things, but he has evidently a success rate of something like 60%.
It is a fact that when certain human beings are suffering not only from addiction but from any ailment that alienates them from society, makes them marginalized, they receive two responses. One is a common person's response, which is aversion, which is exclusion. And the other response is understanding, love, compassion. I think in the world you get people of both kinds.
I think treating other people better, being compassionate, is an important thing to learn how to practice. And I've tried to do that more truthfully. I have a long way to go. I'm no Mother Teresa, let's put it that way. But then who is?
And I really choose my staff accordingly, that I don't like too much of heavy professionalism in my work, because we don't need professionals. We need what we call wounded healers, people who have gone through this suffering themselves and can vibe with the others.
How would I describe a 12-step program? Well, first of all, let me make a disclaimer that I don't feel like I can be a spokesperson for any program, but so I'll just tell you my personal experience is that first of all, the program is it's a stopping ground for someone who is running. It's a place to stop and just say, wait a minute, my life is unmanageable. That's the first thing. You have a sense that what you're doing is just not working and will never work, and you're running yourself.
The first step was literally the first step, which is that we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. And for me, they recommend that you start working with a sponsor. They ask you to find someone in the program, a 12-step program, who has gone through the steps and has a greater amount of time than you to help you through the steps. And so I did that, and that first step was the one that they told me I had to do perfectly. It was just the other ones, they said, you don't have to do the rest perfectly, but you have to get this first one. You have to really admit that you're powerless. You have to really know it and really feel it and really admit it, that you're powerless over alcohol.
I didn't understand step one at all. I didn't understand that I was powerless. I understood that I was unmanageable, but the powerlessness, I was like, I don't really know what that means.
I kind of felt when they talked about the first step of I'm powerless, I thought powerless meant you might as well do it because you have no power. I didn't realize don't do it. I just kind of thought, well, if I'm powerless, what am I fighting this for? I mean, I just might as well keep going. And I didn't understand what that meant. And I mean, the joke of there's no phrase figure it out. I mean, ask somebody. You know, it's a we program, not a figure it out program. And I was trying to figure it out, and you just can't.
The step one was, yeah, it took me a while to get my head around that. But the unmanageability, my life was completely unmanageable. You know, I had a very high-powered job in an advertising agency that was way beyond my means. I blagged my way into this job and was not coping with it at all well. And I lived in this flat that I'd bought, that I'd completely gutted, and I had a blow-up bed on the floor, and a couple of bin liners of clothes, and a TV, and some hi-fi. Nothing else. Didn't have any running water or a kitchen. I mean, I had a bathroom, but I didn't have a kitchen or anything. And I would come home and drink and take drugs and stay up all night playing loud music, talking to myself, and then kind of try and rummage around in the black bin liners looking for something clean to wear, and then get a taxi in the morning because I'd had 1 or 2 hours sleep to work. And then the process would continue the next day. I would score on the way home, buy a drink on the way home, come back to this flat.
For me, it was a struggle in the beginning. I could see how I was powerless because I could literally see, oh, I wouldn't want to drink, but I would do it anyway. And that seemed so clearly powerless to me. But I had a much harder time accepting that my life was unmanageable because it felt like it was pretty manageable, even though it wasn't. But it took me some time to get that second part of the first step.
You know, I think of, I mean, the only time it seemed out of control when everybody around me was saying, you know, you're a disaster. But, I mean, as an addict, I always thought I had it completely under control. And why aren't people just bugging me? You know, I was like, just give me a break.
I guess I'd admitted that I was powerless over alcohol without really understanding that I'd admitted it. But I'd admitted that I had a problem with alcohol when I spoke to the psychiatrist for the first time. He was probably the first person I was ever honest with about drinking, how much I was drinking and how many drugs I was taking. I'd admitted the drugs to some people and I'd admitted the drinking to others, but I hadn't put the two together and gone, this is what I'm really doing. And he was the first man. I did that too.
Give you a very simple, example. The denial syndrome is a big one in recovery. A guy comes and says, yes, I want to get well. What is the degree of his motivation? Who can judge that? By his yes that comes from his lips, or from his, well, as I say, from his head level? Even if he may be very honest from his gut level, who is going to judge that? What is the way you can judge that? Yoga, you can't, the body never tells lies. So, truth, encounter with truth, and the very first step, yoga helps. And that is why we have a set of restorative postures which calms down the persons, kind of brings about a hypometabolic effect. And that leads that person to say to oneself, that I am all right. I am all right. Deep down, I am all right.
And just, they talk about denial. Denial really means you don't even know you're lying. That's what denial is. It's not like you're trying to kid people. Denial is you don't know it. I mean, it's, you could pass a lie detector test.
Denial is causal. Denial, it's a kind of, it's something that doesn't solve itself. It doesn't give you any solutions to figure out how to face what you don't want to face.
When people are challenged with a health problem as addiction, and they do acknowledge in the first step of the program that helplessness, by that helplessness they are led into a hope of a healing process. That healing process has to be recognized as a power higher than their ego.
I had a male sponsor. He was very, very good. And he took me through the steps, and I did a massive step one with him. Huge step one with lots of written work. And I think it was then that I fully understood what my issues were. Because I don't think that my issues were just drinking and alcohol. I think they were a symptom of my issues. And what he taught me to do, or what he showed me to do, was to look at all the areas of my life that were not working and why they weren't working. In step one, I was asked to list in a very particular way all the problems I had in a whole range of areas, which were things to do with my emotions, my finances, my relationships, that sort of thing. And in step two, I was asked to look at all of those issues and to replace them with sane thoughts and sane processes. So it's like, I'm a piece of shit, no one loves me, I'm really unhappy. It would be replaced by, I'm really valuable, I'm doing an amazing thing by getting sober, and I know that people really love me. So I matched everything up, so it was like, it gave me the sanity. I actually had to list out what being sane was. And that was a hugely powerful thing, actually.
The hope comes in the second step when faith is expressed. Came to believe that a power higher than myself can restore me eventually to sanity. That's my hope.
The way he made me do it was he made me put all the negative stuff on one side, fold the paper, and then all the positive stuff on the other. Right. And the combination of that really made me see how insane my thinking was. Because on the left-hand side was nothing but self-hatred, vile, angry bullshit. And on this side it was like, oh my God, of course, you know, God or whatever, the universe doesn't really think that about me. My family doesn't really think that about me. It's my interpretation, it's my perception. And that is insane. That I am allowing my life to be controlled by this negative bullshit in my head.
It's just what I say, you know, it's like, how can I be happy, joyous, and free when I know I'm gonna fuck it up? You know, I'm gonna blow it. You know, that voice inside there, keep your head down, Kev. You know, take the end run. You know, get by. You know.
An addict generally is a confused person with regard to love. As the famous existentialist Martin Buber said, we are all born for love. And as he defined love, love is an I-thou relationship, I-you relationship. An addict has missed it. Either actually missed it, or he has, by his own, she or he has misunderstood. I've got a lot of cases where addicts were born in very loving homes, but they never saw themselves as being loved. So either actually not loved or perceived as not loved leads them to get a substitute. A substitute for an I-thou relationship, there are many in the world. It is called an I-it relationship.
And I think there's something in the alcoholic that is in this loveless debate. You know, is it possible? Can people love me? Can I love myself? What does that mean to love myself? How can I love myself when there's no connection to another human being? You know. So the environment of the process in the program is that it sets up this process of allowing someone to love you, you know, even in just the practicality of call me, you know, how are you doing? Come on with me. Don't go there, come here.
Yoga practitioners and recovery people, before they came into this practice, will admit that they were soaked in lies. And a human being is made for the truth.
Going to meetings, working the steps with a sponsor, and then eventually you become a sponsor and you work with other people who are new and guide them through the steps. And it's through this entire process that you can't help but run into yourself. You can't help but be confronted with yourself if you're sharing honestly.
So step 3, which is make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. I love that step. It is my favourite step because I am a control freak. And I always thought that I could change whatever as long as I went like that. I spent my whole life doing that, hanging on, clinging on, pushing. And this let me off the hook. Step 3 completely let me off the hook of that. I'm like, I'm not in control. I can't, you know, it doesn't matter how much I do, it's already predefined. Somebody else is in charge, I'll let them have the control. I just didn't want it anymore, I couldn't do it. I was too exhausted to try and take a hold of my life. So I was only too willing. I was quite my sponsor was American, so he was into that whole kind of, you know, I was thinking of Americans as being quite sort of ostentatious with their emotions, and so he made me do it in public in this secret garden in Regent's Park where I had to get on my knees and say it out loud, and then he had to hug me and we had to make this big thing of it. So I felt a little bit inhibited about doing it, but I did do it. But it wasn't like a thunderbolt. I know some people just go, I think I was too riddled with my shyness to allow any thunderbolts that might have happened.
I mean, you really have to put down your ego for that stuff, because it's easily, you know, you could be embarrassed. And they say, you know, you can't save your ass and face at the same time.
Surrendering to a higher power, which means letting go of the concept that they can control the circumstances in their life. Like I let go of the circumstances related to my controlling my lover's life and what he was going to do. Letting go of that concept is the first step towards freedom.
Well, what was happening to me and why dealing with a higher power was an issue was that I had, after numerous false starts with recovery and failures, I would say, at it, I became aware, or I became convinced that doing the steps, working with the steps, was the way to recover. I noticed that people who really stayed sober and had commendable sobriety were people who worked the steps, so to speak. I didn't even know what that meant. But so when I started that process with my sponsor, who encouraged me to do that, I realized right away I was going to have difficulty with God, because, you know, my background is extremely religious. I came from a fundamentalist religious background, and I had gone through stages where I had renounced religion completely and was really quite angry at it. So it was just a problem. My sponsor said, he said, here's what I encourage you to do. Here's what I do. I encourage you to do this. Every night before I get into bed, I get on my knees and I thank God for keeping me, and I ask God to keep me sober through the night. And then every morning when I get up, the first thing I do is get on my knees and ask God to keep me sober throughout the day. And I said, I can't do that. I just can't do that. And I tried it, and it made me sick, because it just instantly brought me back into that whole context of church, fundamentalist church, and people, you know, down at the mourner's bench, people thumping you on the back and praying you through confession and all that. And it just made me angry and furious. But everybody was saying it, all my sponsors and all my programs. And so I knew I had to kind of deal with this. So I started working on the steps, and I wrote about my feelings about higher power, about God and so forth. It occurred to me that if I could start my day with a yoga practice, and then I don't remember if I thought of this or I just discovered it, but the practice of getting on your knees, that's one of the first things I did in my class. There I was on my knees with my head on the floor prostrated, and suddenly I realized, oh, I can pray here. And so that became a wonderful ritual. It became my entree into my day. I think the most important thing to get across about me is that yoga, the practice of yoga, enabled me to approach higher power. Without the yoga, I was stuck.
The first 3 steps are related to turning one's will over to a higher power. So if you are interested in the philosophy of yoga, if you can get to that place, some people can start with that, some people can get there after years. But if you're curious enough to read the something in the philosophy of yoga, then you'll see that one of the things that helps one to reveal one's true self to oneself, to see one's true self, one method that Patanjali, who is, you know, one of the sages of yoga, has recommended is surrender to a higher power, Ishvara Pranidhana, so that your whole being is absorbed in the experience of this higher power. That's probably the path somewhat of what we call bhakti yoga, bhakti yogis, you know, devotional love to a higher power.
The step 4 is more psychological tool.
Do you know what it
Yeah, made a searching and a fearless moral inventory of all our misdeeds. So that is a cleansing process which, if you have the gift of honesty, truthfulness, which you get through the discipline of yoga, and then you sit down and do this laboratory, personal laboratory of inner cleansing, you can get the capacity to be truthful about it, about the past, made a searching and fearless moral inventory.
For me, step 4 was fantastic. It was a great way to kind of beat myself up. It's like, I know.
Step 4 is?
Step 4 made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. You know, well, I spent my whole life taking a moral inventory of me, you and anybody else. So it was a great way, self-flagellation, you know. I was like pages and pages and pages of all the hatred and anger and bitterness in my head. You know, I heard one person share that her sponsor stopped her from doing it. He said, it's just too much, and I so related to that. I mean, he didn't stop me, but it was easy to do. Eventually it gets really boring, because you're writing this stuff out like that, and you're like, this is the same stuff. This is the same stuff about this person that I felt about this person and that person. And it becomes incredibly boring.
The first thing that hits a human being in any recovering program is the truth about themselves. Whatever that may be, the person has the humility. And humility for me is truth. Before, you can't see the truth if you are in any way filled with ego. And both the 12 steps and the yogic discipline, truth plays a major role there. So that's my encounter with truth.
For me, the first 3 steps were really connected to yoga in a very strong way, and I was fascinated by them. And Al-Anon then came back and helped me get out of that relationship by taking action. And all of that, of course, is, you know, anyone who studies yoga philosophy understands the relationship between taking action and meditation and seeing the right path for oneself and differentiating between good perception and poor perception of things.
When people do yoga poses, they have to know whether they're doing them accurately or not. They have to know, is it true that I'm straightening my leg? Is it true that I'm straightening my arm? Is it true that I'm doing some movement which is required in these poses? And that constant self-assessment, that constant self-observation in relation to the truth, develops somebody's capacity to adhere to the truth. That becomes very important when one's dealing with one's own emotional, mental activity. That's a harder thing to evaluate, harder thing to be true about, one's own intentions. And so yoga supports 12-step programs in that way, in that it's giving somebody a very practical way of not getting too caught up in their imaginary process, and it keeps their feet firmly on the ground in terms of what's real and what's not.
I've always thought of yoga as being really boring, and the people that do yoga is incredibly naff, vegetarian, hippie type people. And a kind of, not family member, but an ex-boyfriend's sister-in-law said, I've got this yoga that you'll love, come with me. And I went with her to a yoga session, and I did love it. And so she just thought, I think she might like this yoga. And of course I went, fell in love with it, and immediately was like, when can I come again?
One of the teachers in my studio gave a workshop on tapas. And so I looked that up in the book about the Sutras of Patanjali, and it said tapas means burning up of impurities through practice, or at least that's one way to describe it. And I was mesmerized by that concept, because I thought, you mean I could work on the problems I have that make me addicted by my practice. And it clicked that yoga was going to be the way that I was going to move through my recovery from addiction.
In this rehab in 1993 that I went to, after 10 years of trying to figure it out, I went to a couple of different rehabs. I finally went to one rehab that, I mean, it was such a mess. I mean, I was coming off a couple of different types of substances, and this really sweet yoga teacher came in, and you know, the people who wanted to would do a class. I mean, I didn't even realize it was chair yoga. We'd sit in chairs and, you know, try to do triangle pose or just really basic stuff. And I didn't feel any feeling of judgment, or there wasn't any feeling of, you know, you're not really doing it right. Or she was just so accepting and just a beautiful feeling. She had this cute little accent. She's from Australia. And that was my first experience to yoga. You know, just trying to touch your toes sitting in a chair.
So yoga came into my life around 6 or 7 years after I was in recovery. I got in recovery when I was 18, and I began yoga when I was 25. And a friend's mother did a headstand at a party, and it was really inspiring to me. She was in her late 60s, and she was so steady and beautiful to watch her do this unusual thing, you know. And my friend was doing yoga also. I had some friends doing it, and I thought that it really piqued my interest. So I signed up, and I went to a free class, and right away I had a profound experience with the yoga practice. I felt really at home. The same way I felt when I went to AA meetings. I felt like, oh, I found something that really makes sense.
Then the 11th step is nothing but yoga, sought through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God, seeking only the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry that out.
Step 11, which is sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, which is my yoga step. Yoga really helped me with that, because it is about coming back into myself and into my body. And I definitely get a conscious contact when I'm doing my yoga. I suppose my breathing slows down, my head stops to spin, I'm completely in the moment. Definitely kind of just gives me a sense of being in my body, in my space, feet on the ground, in the universe right now, which I have problems with. So yoga's been fantastic for that.
But what keeps me practicing more, I mean, simply put, is that it feels good. It makes me feel good, and it calms me. It allows me to focus. It gives me energy. It seems to fulfill a kind of relationship with my body that seems eternal. You know.
The first benefit, you know, going chronologically that I could identify was physically. I think in many ways I'm in better physical condition now than I was when I was in my 30s. I'm 51 now. And I feel that has given me a sense of well-being, and I've been in pretty good health with not a lot of illnesses, diseases, colds, or whatever. You know, occasionally I have a cold, but I can't so much identify it myself as other people telling me that, you know, I don't look my age, or I look healthy, or this or that. Sometimes that aspect, you know, the superficial aspect of it is not that evident to me. But internally, I feel healthy. And the sense of flexibility I have with my body is something that I've begun to really enjoy.
For me, the first feelings I get from yoga are definitely physical feelings, not necessarily spiritual. It's that amazing feeling you get having stretched and feeling taller and lighter and longer and just a bit more kind of free. You know, the spirit, I'm sure I have, well, I know I have a million miles to travel on the spiritual journey of yoga. I'm just a baby. And I suppose my self-centeredness is all about, oh, I'll be losing a bit of weight here, and this must be making my tummy look flatter, and, you know, I'm not so hunched up. So it's on that level that I engaged with it, definitely, that it was going to be good for me and it was going to make me look better. And then the feeling better, or the spiritual feeling, has come much later.
I discovered Iyengar yoga at the YMCA. I mean, Marcel was teaching a class. She was really tough. And I don't know what it was. I mean, every time I'd finish a class, I felt better. Every time. And some of it was horrible, and she was kind of mean, and you know, it's still, you know, I kept going. I'd go every day.
The strength of the program is actually one day at a time, okay? But when you talk about yogic discipline, it is now, one moment at a time.
One day at a time. And that's the other thing that's so key in 12-step recovery, is that it's just this moment. Can I get through this moment? And sometimes I bring that into my yoga practice, into my practice of the poses. And if I'm holding a difficult pose, or if I'm working on a difficult pose, I might think, just one more moment, just one more second. Can I do it for one more second? Or can I just keep breathing through this adversity?
I think a good way of understanding yoga and yoga postures and everything one sees about yoga, where people appear to be doing very difficult things with their bodies, which might be painful or might be just unmanageable, you know, for a lot of people. One of the most important things to realize about it, of course, it's not a competitive sport. It's not like gymnastics. You're not trying to appear good. It's not a performance art. It's something that you do to make yourself feel better. You can make yourself feel so much better on a physical level by doing yoga poses. Then the possibility of making yourself feel better on a psychological level becomes possible, whereas quite often that's not easily accessible to people.
And being able to cultivate relaxation and calmness of mind. A lot of relaxation techniques I learned from the Himalayan Institute have been really helpful for me. Most people don't know how to relax, either physically or mentally, and being able to help them to do that has been something that I've been working on, as well as trying to experience it myself. I try to meditate, to say my prayers and meditate every morning, even if I just look at my cushion for 5 minutes and wish that I could spend more time there. That to me is better than ignoring it altogether. And Al-Anon promotes meditation. They don't give as much information as the yoga tradition will on how to accomplish that. But they promote it in a general way, and they do want you to cultivate focusing in on something simple, to rest your mind in that place, and to see how the disturbances that grip your perception, your soul, are not really that important. And you know, that is like the Yoga Sutras in a nutshell.
Yoga has taught me so many different type of meditation techniques and so many different venues for meditation. from very formal to walking, and walking meditation I've never been able to do, but I do like to sit and count breath. I do one in Jenny's class where you follow your breath in through one nose, out through from one side of your nostril, out the other. And when I wake up in the middle of the night, I always do that. It's kind of nice. I love following my breath up, seeing it come out, as opposed to saying, what the hell did Christina mean by that? Why did my mom say that to me? I go, one in, one out. What the hell did that guy say when he, it's like, one in, one out. I know I should have charged more money for one in, one out. And it's just that quick how my thoughts come in, go, and to follow my breath. You know, it's a mind-body connection, and it's kind of hard to be all brain. I think the physical aspects of yoga just makes me feel good. And I think feeling better, feeling physically stronger, helps me deal with life stress. I mean, not that any 12-step program is a cure for anything. You know, it's just another tool out there to help me stay sober. And I feel my yoga practice helps me stay sober. It makes me feel better. I feel strong. I deal with people. It reduces my anger. And God, I'm so happy that I have it.
The sober life, living a sober life, you know, in one sense, it's a natural life. You know, I mean, let's just say without alcohol. You know, because there's lots of other things that create an unsober life without, the substance.
Yoga has a stabilizing effect. One of the things that it brings about for everybody who gets involved with it is emotional stability. Basically, people don't freak out quite so easily. And so one of the things that drives people to, their addiction is because of emotional disturbance. So one of the difficulties with addiction is keeping stopped, is no longer getting involved with the substance. So yoga, I've seen my students basically feel more stable and more optimistic that they're going to be able to stay free.
So yoga is my step 11, because I'm quite frantic and hectic, and very rarely sit down to meditate. Well, never sit down to meditate. Barely sit down to take time just to kind of be in my day. I go to yoga, and that is my time, and that is time for me to come back down to earth and to come back into my body. And I definitely make a connection with my higher power. I mean, those internal conversations that you have in your head, generally in yoga, those conversations are, at the moment, conversations about gratitude with my higher power. I feel so grateful when I'm doing yoga, like overwhelmed by how grateful that I am that I'm actually there doing it. I suppose it's because I love physical things. I just love that whole, it just makes me feel so good.
As soon as you get into a practice like yoga, you start seeing the glimpse of where you're going to be. Because those few moments that lift you up from darkness into light, from a death-like situation to a life, from total denial to the truth, sets you free.
I think maybe the way that yoga changed me, psychologically changed my mind, my thinking, was that I became more self-accepting. Because as I would do the asanas, there were days when I would just really feel wonderful, and I'd feel very elegant and graceful, and I could move my body completely into the place that I wanted to go. And there were other days when I was stiff and sore and I was hurting myself and I couldn't figure out how to do it without hurting myself. But somehow the accumulation of the experience gave me the willingness and the ability to stay with what I was experiencing and not give up. And there were a lot of days when I would start when I was really exhausted and not feeling well, when I would start my practice with Shavasana, I would just lie down and say, this is my practice today, I'm going to lie here. And sometimes after lying there, I would get inspired to lift a leg and do something. But it would start with that lying down and accepting that I was exhausted and not feeling well and not feeling fit. And self-acceptance is one of the primary components of recovery from addiction, because you really have to accept that that you're not perfect. A lot of addiction, I think, comes from the desire or the need to be perfect, and the quick realization that you're not perfect, and therefore you just, oh fuck it, you're just going to go eat something you shouldn't, or you're just going to go masturbate and make it feel better, and just get away from it. And when I'm able to accept myself and accept that I'm not doing well, then the next step is I can usually call somebody and say, wow, I'm feeling really terrible, I'm dysfunctional today. And a lot of times after that sequence of events, the first accepting and admitting where I'm at, and two, reaching out to somebody, and sometimes it's just praying. I'm able to pray now and say, okay, God, help me out here, I'm not doing well. Sometimes it's getting on the phone and asking somebody for help. Through that sequence, so many times my day has shifted. Within a half an hour, things that were stuck suddenly start to flow.
Okay, if I've got a good step 11, which is a conscious contact with my higher power, that has a ripple effect throughout the rest of my life. It means that I'm in contact with that higher power, therefore I'm much more ready to hand my will over. It means I'm generally much more calm, because I've handed my will over, so it doesn't really matter what I do with my day, it's already preset. And I just generally have a better day.
And then comes the final step, and that is a psychosocial step. And that step says that having had this spiritual awakening, we practice these principles in all the affairs of our life. Now that is very true about yoga. Because you practice yoga, you can take that calmness, that serenity into every event of your life in the day.
I think the way that yoga really helps with the compulsivity, that aspect of addiction, is that in the practice, I have made it my habit to begin the day with the practice. And there's a real difference to a day when I turn on the computer and start doing emails and so forth before I've done the practice. Then it starts becoming manageable very quickly. And doing the practice, the first thing, I won't be honest, the first thing I do is coffee. I do coffee in the New York Times out of the house. And then I come back and I do my yoga practice. And that makes me feel so good about myself that I have really taken care of something that's important first. And at the same time, it's sometimes difficult to do that. If there are a lot of things on my schedule for that day, and I'm backed up with a lot of things that are giving me pressure, to take the time to do the yoga, sometimes my mind is screaming, don't do this, get to work. And to say no to that, and to say, I'm going to do this practice first. I'm going to take care of my body first. And take care of my spiritual life first. Has given me, I think it's really kind of the answer to compulsivity, because Yeah, compulsivity is about always following what's pressuring you, what's calling you from this side and that side, and to not do that instead and say no. I'm going to do the practice first. Is really powerful.
I'm more present in my body. I can stand and receive without deflection from my practice. I can take that breath before reaction. There's distance between what's coming at me and how I react. And I've learned that in my body. I've learned that from the practice.
When you are there, yukta, yoga, in yoga, you get connected. You get connected with the center of your being. Then you recognize that you are living on the periphery of your being, pressing one another's buttons and reacting. Now, from the center of your being, you don't react, you respond. And your response is beautiful.
The steps are really a way of freeing me from my habits, you know. And I think that practicing the yoga poses and the yoga breath work has been a real liberation for me, from literally my body, and then the mind and the spirit seem to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked all the steps now, and I work several steps on a daily basis, or I try to. Step 8 is made a list of people who we'd harmed, which was a very easy step for me. It was all there on my 4, so I made my list of all the people that I had harmed, and I couldn't quite separate step 8 and step 9, because step 9 is about going to make amends to those people. So it was difficult to make the list because I kept thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to go and see that person. I don't really want to do that, perhaps I won't put them on. But I did do quite a comprehensive list and went through it with my sponsor. And then step 9 was going and making amends for those things. And that was also another life-changing step. I think lots of people find that step 9 is a huge, huge step. You know, I made the most amazing amends to my mother. Really quite moving. And yeah, really quite magical, making amends to my mother.
Once a person has led oneself into a state of dispossession, nothing has a capacity to upset the person. Nothing has the capacity to make the person, feel good. He is not dependent, she is not dependent on anything external. He is whole and complete. And so you come from being. When you come from being, there's no problem.
Before I came into recovery, I would never have talked to you about a higher power. I didn't have any idea what that was. I didn't have a problem with God. I wouldn't have said I was religious. But I did lots of Sunday school. I had lots of Bibles. I had quite a spiritual experience as a small girl once in my garden. And I was at Sunday school, and there was a reading, a story about asking God to come into your heart. And I must have been, 6 or something. And I remember standing under a tree and saying, please God, please, will you come into my heart? And I had that, that feeling you get when you listen to an amazing piece of music and that kind of tingling. Yeah. I had this kind of body sensation and felt different. And at the time I didn't really understand it, but as I've reflected, I thought that was my first spiritual experience. So I was too pissed and too mad and too out there trying to grab a pound note or whatever to ever follow a spiritual path, getting sober, forcing me to slow down, forcing me to have a look at that relationship, because that's what they teach you in AA. It is a spiritual program. You don't get that spiritual stuff, it's likely you'll get pissed. I've had to do it. So it's not been hard for me to use the word God. I'm quite choosy about who I say God to.
I think yoga offers a sobriety of mind and spirit that is really beyond satisfying, beyond my own expectations. And if I'm relying on a crutch like alcohol or drugs to give me some altered state of consciousness, at this point for me, it's not even interesting. It doesn't hold the appeal or the allure that it used to, because I'm so clear on where that takes me personally.
I think that I would not be the person that I am today if I hadn't had to come to terms with the fact that I was a drug addict and an alcoholic. And I didn't understand it when people said they were really grateful that they were alcoholics or drug addicts, but I am totally grateful, because I have had to reevaluate who I am and my life and how I am in the world.
A drunken mind is in delirium. It's delirious. But a sober mind is in expansion, is in, in terms of the practice, what you get from a really wonderful practice is a feeling of wholeness and a feeling of extraordinary self-possession, and that the energy in you is even and full, transparent, porous, light, bright.
When people ask me, is yoga going to help? They're asking me from a position of pain. They're asking me from a position of having gone through some terrible, devastating, life-wrecking experience, and they're in recovery, and it's not too comfortable. And my answer is yes, yoga can help. Of course it can help. It helps in conjunction with the 12-step program, and the chances are that you can be successful with this and put your life back together, and also come away with a tool which is going to help you develop yourself further. It's beyond recovery in the sense that, yes, one wants to stop, yes, one wants to recover, right? But also one wants to go further into all those things that yoga can offer you. Basically, tremendous physical health that can give you emotional stability, and a tool that, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can explore your spiritual life, explore your relationship to your spiritual identity in a way that has been proven over centuries to be safe and okay.
It did kind of allow certain inhibitions, to, release. But I could never work having had a drink. I would always, it was always after. But it also kind of allowed my imagination also to let loose. I mean, so there are some good things about the alcohol, it just kind of freed me of certain constraints and inhibitions that were necessary to express myself without being shamed or feeling shame from my parents, because my mother was always one to say, and being in the environment of this kind of Irish Catholic, you keep your head down, don't think too much of yourself, and that kind of feeling. So, and of course, they were all drinking as well. Well, I think every time I woke up or tried to wake up, and I just felt like I had a brick in my head, and those things. Of course, that's, you think to yourself, oh, geez, I got to back off for a while here, and then the next night's the same thing, or not even the next night. Could be the next week. It wasn't like that all the time with me. I could drink socially, and but as soon as I had enough, then there was no stopping, and there was no limit, except, the time.
I began practicing yoga out of a need. My need was that I used to be a singer. I used to have to do a lot of public performances, church mainly, choirs, concerts. And every time a performance came up, I would have a problem with my health. And using all kinds of medications and all that to get the best voice on stage used to be a frustration. Then I was never a sports person.
Getting embarrassed all the time about money. So I started to address that through the 12-step program a long time ago, about 15 years ago now, I think. And then through my recovery in that program, which has wafted and waned over the years, I became aware that that I might be sexually addicted. I didn't really think so at first, but I heard someone talk about his problems with sexual addiction, and I thought, oh, I really need to talk to this person because I was getting into some deep trouble.
I think the way one perceives people who are defining themselves as an alcoholic or an addict is that you tend to see them as somebody separate from yourself, somebody, from a voyeuristic position. You're curious about their experience in the extremes that they've experienced. But really you very quickly see that we're all in the same boat, that we're all suffering one way from behaviors which we can't control.
I'm a member of Al-Anon, which is a program designed for family members or relatives of alcoholics. And to qualify as a member of Al-Anon, you basically just need to have had some experience in dealing with alcoholism in your life, with a close relative or friend generally. One of my attempts in the program is to try and identify why I got in a relationship with an alcoholic, since I couldn't identify alcoholics in my own family. The program doesn't require you to identify the root of your behavior, but because of my way of thinking, my logical mind, I tend to do that. And what I've noticed about myself is that certain aspects of my relationship with my parents, and my mother in particular, may have led me to be susceptible to being in a relationship with someone who was not healthy for me. And normally people would know how to get out of that relationship, but my inability to get out of it kept me, in
I don't have a problem with answering questions about alcoholism because I think that it's such a huge problem for so many people, and it's part of my, not duty's too strong a word, it's part of my recovery process to allow people into that part of my life and to own it, and there might be somebody out there who is struggling, who might want some help, who will think, oh my God, that girl's an alcoholic, perhaps she can help me. So that's why I'm prepared to talk about it.
When I first got sober, I used to think this was, really not the thing I wanted to advertise to anybody, that I had this problem. And it's really turned out to be such a source of strength for me to know that I had this problem and to know that I could overcome it. How bad it got was the last time that I ever had a drink. It is the one that particularly stands out, not because it was the worst time, but just because it was the last time. And I had already been blacking out when I was drinking. Pretty much every time I drank, didn't really matter what I drank, or there would be a period of time that I wouldn't be aware of what I was saying or doing or where I was. It's called a blackout. And that had been progressing, and the timings of the blackouts were getting longer.
Well, it didn't, it neither made me it probably didn't make me a better actor, although...
The relationship for a prolonged time. So it's not that I necessarily sought out alcoholism, but when it came into my life, I didn't know how to move away from it.
I came to AA about 7 years ago. I'll be 7 next week, and I didn't want to be in AA. And I came to AA because I was in a psychiatric hospital where I'd had a breakdown. And I was diagnosed by this doctor that I found myself in his office in bits, and he said, you're an alcoholic and you're probably a drug addict and you need to come in and sleep. I hadn't really slept for about, I don't know, 6 or 7 months, and so I went into his hospital primarily for a week to sleep, and at that point I didn't know, I hadn't really taken on board. I think I knew that I was an alcoholic, I knew I was drinking alcoholically, but I didn't think that I was an alcoholic, if that makes any sense. And after about 6 or 7 weeks in the hospital, I got bored of all the other patients who were mostly people who had had breakdowns for other reasons, and so I went to AA. He said to me, I want you to go to AA, so I went to AA. And it was everything I thought it wasn't going to be. And it was an amazing experience. And from that day on, for the next 3.5 years, I went every day to an AA meeting. It was bad enough for me, and I stopped comparing my bottom to other people's in terms of AA. I might compare it in terms of how big is my bum, but I do think that for me, I've been really lucky. I had a rock bottom. It was serious enough for me to take it really seriously, and I haven't relapsed, so I haven't had a drink since that day. And I do think that if you don't experience that kind of drastic situation or intervention, it can be quite difficult to do the steps necessary to stop drinking.
And rock bottom is a basic realization that I don't have to deny who I am. I am who I am, and it's beautiful the way I am. I also hit a realization. So after ordination, I also went into completely no exercise syndrome. So that was telling on my health. And lastly, I'm not ashamed to say this, that I come from a family of addictive history. So I was inclined to go into alcoholism.
I mean, I'm 6'9". I remember being in the 4th grade and the desks came up to here on me. And I remember someone looking into the window saying, how many times has that kid been left back? I mean, I was this big at 13 years old. I always felt very uncomfortable in my skin. And I was always looking for something to make me feel comfortable, to take away the unease or they talk about disease or the dis-ease of self. And, you know, it's much easier to come from outside substances than, you know, as a kid, where do you pull it in from? I mean, unless someone's training you. And, you know, my first substance, I guess, was food, because I was very heavy. But I was shamed by other kids from being fat. And they'd say, look, he has breasts. And that was very embarrassing. And drugs and alcohol really it was like a zip line or something. It was just very easy to get into. Everyone was accepted. It was kind of the time. Timothy Leary, tune in, turn on, drop out. I mean, it would have been nice if he told people get your PhD first. Telling 12-year-olds to do that wasn't the best advice.
Well, the first manifestation of addiction of which I became aware was my extreme problems with money. Debting, using credit when I didn't have money to pay for things, being completely unconscious about my money, how much I had, how much I was spending, bouncing checks, getting into debt.